Ladies and gentlemen, we are back standing in the presence of Melbourne greatness. Emily Wallace.
I don't know about that.
Welcome to Sydney.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a few years since we caught up.
It has,
I still remember it was like 2020. We're sitting at the Star, both new to the industry.
Yep.
And talking about how we're going to dominate.
Totally. Yeah, we were both probably very naive and very, what are we doing?
A lot of water under the bridge since then.
Yeah,
and
100%.
Now, look, the blue suit. For people who aren't watching the video, it is
the blue suit. I need it in every colour. It's very comfortable.
Is blue your colour, or you just cycle through
Green's
colours?
actually our main colour,
Right.
but blue. I'm feling blue today.
See, I used to rock the pink suit, and then I realised that suits weren't for me. So,
yeah, fair.
So I'm not as fashionable. So. You specialise in helping the young female or women, whatever the term is, demographic in Melbourne absolutely crush the property market. So what I want to cover off in this episode is, one, how you're seeing the overall Melbourne market.
Yep.
You work in some of the best suburbs in Melbourne. A lot of media out there at the moment with Perth and Adelaide overtaking the median. So let's talk through that. I think overall, no one really talks about, women who are single, women who want to buy property.
Yep.
We were just talking offline. I have a client who's coming on the podcast next week who said that, there's a lot of women out there who don't know who to look to for property advice, financial advice, and money advice. So let's talk through that.
Definitely.
And then all the things in between.
Love it.
So let's start with the Melbourne property market. What is happening in Melbourne at the moment?
Grand old question.
If you read the headlines,
Yeah.
it's all turned to shit, but I don't think so, and I'm assuming you don't think so
No,
either.
not in what we buy. So if I speak to our agents that we deal with, they're sort of like, look, how are you finding out there? And because we cover a lot of ground, they all want to know, what's the north side doing? What's the south side doing? The general consensus is deals are harder and there are more terms on deals.
Right.
So 2021, you couldn't get anything with a finance clause in it. Forget it. Like everything was flying. Now you can kind of get things with a bit more favourable terms to the buyer.
For the buyer, yeah. Right.
But it's not like crazy discounts. Not in what we're buying. Maybe the B and C grade stuff is, but we really aim for A grade. And
you're buying blue chip markets, right? Like
yeah,
what would be
definitely.
average distance from the city, like within 20 or 30 Ks?
Oh yeah, less than 20 Ks.
Right.
Yeah.
So the best suburbs inside of Melbourne.
Yep, where everyone wants to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're big blue chip advocates and obviously buying in those markets, limited amount of stock, right? There's no house and land packages there or anything like that.
They're not making any more. And in fact, the ones that do struggle are the ones that were probably built, anything from post 2017 really. And sort of like those crappy floor plans
Newer
of
stock.
apartments. Yeah. That actually investors bought a lot off the plan. But really what we're buying are those older 70s, 80s brick builds that need, a facelift.
You also said offline that you guys obviously buy a lot of boutique apartments in the suburbs where owner-occupiers want to live in boutique apartments, right?
Definitely.
That's how I started my investing journey in an apartment. So talk me through that. Like for a lot of people, and again, a consensus is getting into Melbourne or Sydney as a first-time buyer.
Yep.
Impossible. Never going to happen, right? But that's if you want to get into a big house, right? You can still get into some really good suburbs inside of Sydney and Melbourne.
Certainly.
For relatively affordable, in quotation marks, prices, right?
Yep. Depending what your income
so
is.
What does that,
but
what does that look like?
So a lot of it is 2-bedroom older brick apartments.
Yeah.
And sort of purchase price anywhere from $750 up to $950.
Which people wouldn't think.
Yeah.
People wouldn't think you could get into Melbourne for like sub $1 million.
Particularly those who come from Sydney. We were looking at the realestate.com as we were like driving around this area. I'm like, oh, this is really like, for reference for listeners in Paddington, the prices. But you put this in a comparison area, suburb of Melbourne, say like an Armidale, a Paran, Windsor, in a southeast. You can definitely pick up. We bought for a client earlier this year, off market, probably was a 95 square metres internal.
Which is, for people who don't know apartments, decent size.
Yeah, very decent size. Oversized 2-bedroom for, I think we paid $830.
Which is crazy.
In a leafy green street with, the tram line down one end and a train on the other and access and everything.
Minutes from the city.
Yeah.
In one of the best suburbs, all the restaurants and everything else.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's a prime example about, buying the right asset in the right location, right? Because a lot of people would have purchased apartments in Melbourne, probably those ones that were built post 2017.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of videos on places like Docklands, for example, where then you just paint Melbourne with a brush, never buy apartments in Melbourne. When it's actually not like that. It's like, don't buy certain apartments in certain suburbs inside of any city, regardless if it's Melbourne or not.
Yeah, exactly. And the proof is in the pudding of the resale. So you look at where these properties were bought and purchase prices that were made. Actually, a lot of investors that bought them, selling out to first home buyers, there actually is pretty good growth on them. And the rental yield hasn't been too bad. So,
what is the average yield at the moment?
Well, probably about 4, 3.5,
That's
4,
good. That's
which
a
is
balanced
not
asset.
Yeah.
I mean, when rates weren't 6.5% and they were like hovering around 3 or 4, that's a decent yield.
Yeah.
And the overall marketplace, you said, was a little bit softer, or maybe more in the buyer's favour than it is to the seller's favour. But it sounds like in blue chip marketplaces, it's not like an $800,000 property last year is now selling for $650,000.
No, I'll give you a great example. We were bidding on the weekend on something that was quoted up to 1.65 mil. I had a budget of 1.8 or just over. It sold for 182 something or other. The neighbouring property sold in 2021 for 1825. It was unrenovated. The property I was bidding on was renovated. That little balance there is kind of like, oh, okay, it has pulled back a bit, but it's not drastic. Like, it's not like all these buyers are coming in and being like, oh, we need a really good bargain. The areas that people want to live in are always popular, and particularly family homes. This time of year, getting ready for school next year, get the kids settled, like that drives a lot of deadline buying. And I think leading into December, we'll see a lot more of that sort of hype.
And what about the legislation changes? I mean, they don't necessarily affect owner-occupier buyers, but for investors, land tax changes. Like, what has happened? Because I don't think a lot of people actually understand. They know what's impacted the market, but they don't know what has actually changed.
It's a very knee-jerk reaction, I think, to act on something that, like I know for me, I own a property in Melbourne as an investment, and like the impact was like a couple $100. It wasn't drastic. It wasn't like a year.
Yeah, right.
Like I can make that up. And also have buffers,
so as Tim Gurner
so
would
like
say,
it's
maybe
not
just like one bit less of avocado toast, right? Like
pretty much. No, but I think the biggest thing is for serial investors who had like a lot of Melbourne covered, almost like a monopoly board of all Melbourne. Yeah, it's going to hurt you. But I find it so interesting that people are like, oh, there's another tax, so I'm getting out. Just seems really reactive.
It is.
Yeah.
100%. And it's interesting when someone can spin a narrative to push another bias.
Yeah.
They do that, right?
Totally. That's the media for you, right?
If it affects Melbourne in a negative way because it benefits someone else in a positive way, and especially in the property industry, right? Yeah. A lot of people like you and I who push other locations. Yeah. If you talk bad about something, which really actually, by the sounds of it, doesn't have a material effect on the everyday investor. No. That means it can be easier to sell them into something else. For sure.
I think the biggest thing we need to watch out for, though, is the number of... So these investors are selling out, first-home buyers are buying in, but we still need rentals, And I know landlords, landladies, whatever...
I call them slumlords.
Slumlords. We're all one of them, apparently. But we actually need investment properties, and there's a lot of, particularly on social media. Yeah. But particularly on social media, people are like, oh, they're the worst. It's like, okay, but if you didn't have rental properties, where would you go? We actually need them.
Oh, yeah, but government can own the rental properties, not individuals.
Really?
I've seen that comment
so
much. I've seen that comment, like when people say that, oh yeah, but investors, we shouldn't be able to buy investment stock.
Yeah.
And then someone will say, well, where would you live if you're a renter? Oh, we could live in a government-owned property. Doesn't make sense.
No, that doesn't make sense.
And actually in New Zealand, which I am not 100% cluey on, but I have a few clients from New Zealand buying into the Australian market.
Yeah.
To buy an established property in New Zealand as an investment property, you can't just do it like Australia. They make it very hard.
Okay.
And the deposit amount you need is significantly higher. If you buy brand new, different.
Yep.
Because obviously it stimulates new building.
Yeah.
But if you buy established, from my understanding, it's a 30 to 40% deposit needed to get into an investment property.
Cash heavy to get in. That's a lot.
So they've obviously raised the bar to make it less, I guess, accessible.
Yeah. Interesting.
So for let's use your personal sort of situation as an example. You have an investment property in Melbourne pre this new tax coming in.
I don't. My land tax was like minimal. Like I
so
think
like
300, like pretty much non-existent. Yeah.
New tax coming in.
I think it was 856 or something.
So $500, $600 difference over a year.
Yeah, and you can tell it's not enough for me to remember the numbers.
Yeah,
like, do you know what I mean?
Like, it hasn't been like a substantial.
No. I saw it and I was like, oh yeah, fix it up.
So if someone owns one property or no properties and wants to buy an investment property in Victoria,
I don't think it's deterring. But interesting stats. I was speaking to an agent just yesterday and he said this one particular office for the financial year last year, I think it was 59% of their sales were investors selling out, and only 14% were investors buying in.
Which means...
And this is in an inner southeast suburb of Melbourne.
40-odd% or 30-something percent of those sales then went to owner-occupiers, which means less stock in the marketplace.
Yeah, which means more competition, more emotional buying. That's what's keeping everything afloat, I think, you know.
That's so interesting. But is there an opportunity there? Because if
no investor...
Like, the reality is Melbourne as a city is pegged to have the largest population.
Yeah.
Right?
And it will. I think it's the most functional city. When you look at infrastructure, apart from the fact that they don't have a train from the airport to the city, that's one big flaw. But apart from that, the infrastructure there is actually amazing. It's a very livable city. It's easy to get around.
I mean, you don't have a harbour, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not as pretty.
I'm Sydney biased, but I agree. Like you can walk to most places, or jump on the tram, or get in an Uber, and you're a few minutes.
Yeah.
Great city to run in. I'm a big runner, so I really like Melbourne to run in. And up until when did this change happen? Last year or the year before?
No, last year. Up
until then, Melbourne was the strongest performing city for the previous 25 years.
Yeah.
I saw an Aussie home loans report up to 2020, I believe it was.
Okay, yeah.
And Melbourne performed the best out of the capital cities over that whole period.
There you go.
So with one little legislation change, which the reality is hasn't materially changed cash flow for the majority of investors, but has changed sentiment, which is how people think and act, there's probably an opportunity there.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you're not paying a big premium like you would have paid if the market was booming, say, like Perth.
Totally. And I think the hurt isn't it's not enough hurt. I think the thing that would really change the game is revisiting stamp duty. That's what would really change the game.
Positive or negative?
I think, well, it depends what side of the fence you sit on, but I think, look, if it was very, like a variance based on homeowner versus investor, a bit like the New Zealand model with the higher deposit, if it was higher for investors but more accessible for first home buyers, which there is, caps. Every state has these, concessions.
What is the concession for?
It's no stamp duty up to 600,000, and then a sliding scale.
Property.
Yes, and then a sliding scale up to 750.
So 0 to 600, no stamps. 600 to 750.
Sliding scale reduction, and then
by the time
750
it gets to 750 and over it, nothing.
Yeah.
What about
correct?
You do the 5% deposit?
We've actually had a lot of clients use the government scheme for the 5% deposit to get in, and it's worked. It means they can keep cash heavy. They might have a 20% deposit, but they're only using 5%. And so they're sort of, using it for other things or investing in shares or whatever else.
I say that to clients all the time. And if you actually go into a property with a 5% deposit, let's say 600 grand, $30,000, in the grand scheme of it, it's not a lot of dough.
No, you're in.
And we'll talk through what you can get for that, say 600 grand, because it's going to be a thing someone asks for sure. 30 grand. If you then look at, you hold that property for 15 years, it goes from 600 to 1.2 to 1.5 million bucks. You've made 700 grand in growth. You've only put in 30 grand of your own money.
That's pretty cool.
So the return on your capital is significantly higher than if you put in the 20% anyway. And if you're not paying LMI and you're not paying stamp duty, there's no real cost other than holding costs.
It's just the nuance of understanding what the government can and can't do or allow you to do with the property. Renovations are a slight, you've got to get things approved.
Right.
But I've not had any complaints from clients who have bought using the scheme.
Interesting. Yeah. And then once they get to an 80% loan to value ratio, not from paying the debt down, say, but
the
property
value,
pricing.
they can take them off.
Right. So then you can remove them, and then you have essentially full capability to do whatever you want. Interesting. Let's say you are a first home buyer listening to this podcast, 600 grand in Melbourne. Where would Emily Walls buy?
Oh, that's such a great question. I would be looking at getting a little bit of land component in a villa unit. Villa units are really popular in somewhere like a Mentone or a Cheltenham area.
How far is that from the city?
Down the Bayside. Probably about 17 kilometres from the city.
So not far.
Not that far. On the northwest side, really underrated, Glenroy, Oak Park and Pascoe Vale South. It's another little pocket. That's closer to the city. It's probably about 12, 13 k's. And it's also near the airport.
Which is super close for a city of Melbourne size. Like, for context, we're in Sydney, 12 k's from Sydney. You're still spending many, many millions of dollars for a house.
I've noticed.
Which is, and Melbourne's population will be greater than Sydney's very soon.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's crazy. It's just like something's got to change, right? Like,
the difference is, I think, in Sydney is like we're landlocked with. We've only got like from here till Bondi Beach, which is the edge of Sydney. There's only a couple of k's, and then we've got the Blue Mountains on the other side. So there's like a finite amount of land, which obviously drives prices.
Whereas Melbourne, the sprawl is a lot easier to occur.
Truganina, that's my parents' fault. They didn't do too well. So 600 grand, you'd get not an apartment by the sounds of it. You'd probably get a villa
unit, yeah.
Are they strated in Melbourne?
Yeah, usually they are strata, but
Yep.
a minimal, like a non-active body corporate, just with driveway and building insurance. It's
Right.
like, $2,000 a year, worst case.
So next to nothing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
generally, how many are in a block?
Oh, 4 to 6.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, nothing.
individual unit, single level generally.
Yep, with a garage,
Yeah.
courtyard, 2 bed, 1 bath.
And
Probably
it's very
needs some-
common for owner-occupiers to live in that kind of
Yeah.
product
Yep.
close to the city.
Very common. Yeah. People usually go to them because they say, I don't want an apartment, but I can't afford a townhouse.
Right.
So what's that in between? It's those villa units.
Because Melbourne
yeah.
is a very urban style
Yeah.
of environment, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Like in Sydney, townhouses are less popular and villas are less popular than they would be
Sure.
in Melbourne for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. No,
Where apartments here, I reckon there's way more apartments.
definitely. Yeah, even just
Smaller
looking
blocks.
around.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot more. Look, I think a lot of people got scared in Melbourne with the cladding issues of the apartments and kind of got the Victorian government stepped in and tried to fix everything. And the audit has been completed. So most of the levies are dealt with, but it scared a lot of people and they just painted all apartments with the same brush.
And that's
Like,
obviously
don't
the
touch
newer
apartments.
blocks of apartments when
Yeah.
they built them and they put that flammable cladding on it.
Yeah, yeah. So sort of early 2000s apartments.
Yeah.
A lot of them had issues, but they rectified most of them.
Let's talk about a horror story recently that you were just telling me about.
Oh, yes.
In these older style blocks where you own 1 of 4, 1 of 6,
Yep.
you own a portion of the land.
Yes.
If we flip the page and go to these scary ones, which is like Brunswick has got a lot of apartments, right? Like
Yeah, Brunswick, East Village. Anywhere to the city. Really.
Docklands. Jack loves Docklands.
Yeah, I don't like Docklands.
Jack hates Docklands. But in those style of apartments,
Yeah.
high density,
Yes.
hundreds of apartments sometimes in a
Yeah.
block, you own almost nil of the land it sits on.
Totally.
They're the ones with those.
Oh
issues,
yeah, with
right?
the issues, yeah, and just the resale value. Like even so, I rent an apartment in a higher rise in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And I'd never buy in the block. I would never in a million years buy into that block because of the issues with it, but also the amenity, the outgoings. But it makes sense for me to rent and live there. For context, like even on my own apartment, right? My owner bought it in 2017 off the plan for $1,070,000. The identical floor plan has just sold one above me, so supposedly better, for $940,000.
Wow.
So what's that? $130K gap.
Plus stamps, plus
yeah,
holding costs.
all
What
that.
would strata be in the building or for your apartment?
It's about $9,000 a year. Yeah.
$9,000 a year. And has there been special levies?
Yes, and there's about to be another one.
There you
Yeah,
go.
it's like I just wouldn't you wouldn't touch it. But also, like I know I'm paying $750 a week in rent. Like I don't know what the gap is for my owner, but I reckon it's pretty good.
I mean, let's assume you borrowed 100% of that
Yeah.
$1 million. You're paying 65, 70 grand a year in just interest
Yep.
alone.
Yep.
Plus your 9,000 a year for strata, plus your special levies on top. So you're
Yep.
really probably in the hole for 100, give or
Yep.
take, and you're paying 40 grand a year to be
to
there.
live there. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And that's the power of rent vesting, right? And then it's like
Totally.
if you look at, okay, you have the $1 million to spend, you don't spend it on that property, you rent for $750. You then go spend that $1 on an investment property,
Yep.
of
Okay,
which
that's
potentially could get a higher rental yield.
Yep.
So you get $800 or $900 a week for that.
Yeah.
The debt's then tax deductible. All of your expenses related to that property are then tax deductible. And sure, you are paying your tax with after tax, your rent, with after tax income.
Yeah.
But you're getting a deduction
On
on
the
the
other
mill.
side. Yeah. Yeah.
And
It-
you can still claim a portion of your rent if you've got home offices and all the rest of it.
Do you know what? It's a real moral dilemma I play in my brain around rent vesting and doing what I do as a buyer's advocate because I help people into homes, right? And I'm always asked people, and I challenge people a lot on my discovery calls, like, okay, why is it that you want to buy? Like, what's the goal?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me, and maybe I forget that people really want security. They want to know where they are. They don't
it's so
like
fascinating.
it does fascinate me. And they're my clients, right? And I can see it and I can empathize with it. Sometimes I've slipped into like, oh, do I need to buy my place yet? And, what do I want to buy? And I love like the unknown of,
Me too.
changing. And actually, I listened to one of your podcasts recently, or maybe you were interviewed on something and you said that you move around a lot. Like,
I haven't lived
every
in
12
one property for
Yeah.
longer than 12 months in the last 6 years.
I'm exactly the same. Literally, I think it's actually probably since I moved to Melbourne since I was 18. So
Wow.
probably, 13 odd years. And I love change. I love trying new areas.
Me
I
too.
couldn't commit. Like, I couldn't confidently commit to buying my own property
Maybe
yet.
we both just have commitment issues.
Yeah, maybe.
It is
think so.
fascinating though. But
Yeah.
and the thing that fascinates me even more with the people who say, I want security, it's like there is no difference between whether you rent or whether you own. Like, sure, when you own, you can't be kicked out
Yeah.
in quotation marks.
Yeah.
But if you're on a fixed term agreement, rental agreement, you can't be kicked out anyway.
Totally.
At the end of your agreement, sure, you can be asked to leave.
Yeah.
But if the worst was to happen and you were to lose your job and couldn't pay your mortgage, guess who's going to ask you to leave?
Yeah.
The person with the first mortgage over your property, which happens to be the bank, you know?
Probably worse. Yeah, it's an interesting concept, but
It's just like this belief system.
yeah, it is.
I'm not sure, you probably haven't listened to the podcast. I had a guy called Derek Sivers on my podcast, and he wrote a book called...
Was he talking about the problem, like housing has always been a problem since the start? Was that...
No, that was what's his name, that gentleman? He's an economist.
Yes.
So Derek Sivers was on my Flamingo Sundays podcast.
Oh, right.
And for people who are listening to this, if you're into like belief systems and all that stuff, listen to that. He's got a book called... he's got a book that's just come out. It is called Useful Not True.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, as human beings...
Yeah.
We often walk around in life, and I'm digressing here, but we walk around in life thinking things or believing things to be factually true that are actually not true.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like lots of things, right?
Yeah.
It's like we just make these beliefs up and go, oh, that's the truth. When the reality is it's not the truth. It's just something that we believe. And that thing is exactly that, like that home ownership thing, having security.
Yeah.
I'm like, I move into a house, I feel so secure.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if someone asks me to leave, I'm like,
another one.
you just ring and go, hey, Mr. Removalist, can you please come and get all my shit?
Yeah.
Because I need to move to a new place.
Yeah.
And the other thing with rentvesting is as you start to, and this is not relevant for everyone, but I found this and you may have, as you start to go up in price point from like what you pay in rent, once you get out of that sort of price point where 80% of the population are renting there's less and less competition.
There is.
And it's so much easier to get a really good property.
Yeah, you can, but you can also negotiate a bit better as well. Like
Massively.
even I've done that previously where I've shaved a fair bit off the weekly rent. Like, just may as well try, may as well ask a
100%.
question. But yeah, you're right. There is less competition because usually at that price point, people got a mortgage.
100%. And I know you work with a lot of young clients. I work with a lot of young clients. We're both young people. For people who are renting as like a conglomerate or a share house or something like that, 2 or 3 or 4 friends.
Yeah.
Like I always say, do $200 or $300 a week each. And go and rent something for like $1,500 a week. For all of you guys.
Yeah.
Still works at the same. And you've all of a sudden got all this flexibility. And you can also lock in longer leases. Like if you say to landlords, hey, 2-year lease and we'll give you a 5% increase at the end of year 1. That's a great deal for you and for them. So
no reletting costs, security for them.
And they get an increce in rent. They're like, and you as a tenant also get the thing that people are so scared of, which is security.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's
a funny concept, isn't it? I do obviously I really understand home ownership and the idea around it, given what I do and who I help. But yeah, it's this constant, even in my own brain, I'm like, oh, should I buy something? I don't know. Like even recently I've been looking back in Elwood. I'm like, I want to be in Elwood. I want to make sure I can like have something to come back to in Elwood. I'm like, I can find a rental if I needed to. It's it's a real
I
challenge.
think Chris Gray helped me with that because Chris when he was mentoring me back in the day always said like, I look at it as a positive. If my landlord wants me to leave, it's actually cheaper for me to go on holidays than it is to stay in the country. Because if I'm spending, $1,500, $2,000 a week in rent, I could go and hang out in Noosa for the week. So it's fascinating.
Love that. Yeah.
You look after a lot of women,
Yep.
females, whatever you want to call them. I call them women and females to buy amazing property.
Yeah.
Because you are a young woman, maybe, whatever. And you've got your own story and you've like really niched into that, which I love.
Yes.
They don't, I guess, get enough direct assistance, I believe. There's no one, producing content and educating, like, because I think as men and women have different belief systems.
Yeah.
The fact is they have different earning capacities if you look at it on the average, which whether you believe it's right or wrong, it's just fact. And what really hit home is when my client said to me, hey, no one is like guiding these people.
Yeah.
So what do you find like when you have young women come to you, what are their biggest like questions and like fears if they're like that independent person who's like, hey, I'm here and I want to do this, regardless of someone's helping me? I
think the smartest thing about them is they know to outsource.
Yeah.
They're like, this is not my forte. This is not my skill set. I'm really good at my job. I have a high income. I have capacity to outsource. So I'm going to outsource.
Yeah.
And I want someone that I can trust. Usually they've been out for maybe 2 or 3 Saturdays on their own. And I hate saying this because I definitely get treated differently than the general public when it comes to real estate agents, given what I do and the relationships I've built. But they are not taken seriously by the agents, or I've known some to, even partners buying together, they speak to the male. And it's just this,
It's fact. Yeah.
you know, ingrained part of how they operate. I don't know if they do it consciously or unconsciously, but it's one of these things where I had a discovery call recently and the girl was just like, I just need someone else because I'm not being taken seriously. I'm 23 buying my first property and I just don't even think that they think I'm going to buy anything. It's like,
true.
wow.
And most
You know?
real estate agents, I don't know what the percentage would be males.
Oh, but highly, yeah.
And I know as a male,
Yeah,
I find it way more comfortable to be able to talk to another male
of course.
than a woman. I don't know why that is, but it's
Yeah.
just like this natural
Yeah,
instinct.
totally.
So
yeah.
that's probably why male agents would be like, oh, straight to talk to the male, right?
Yeah, for sure.
They probably find it intimidating to talk to.
They probably do. They
a
probably
young-
don't like, oh, it's like when you're, you know, in your early 20s, like, I don't know how to talk to a 5-year-old. I'm just not sure how
that's
that
right.
works. So the dynamic is different. So that's one of the things that they say. The other thing is, like, one of the commonalities in what they're buying is security. And obviously there's been a lot around women feeling secure and safe. A lot of these clients are buying apartments that have, you know, double security doors before they get to the front door, just like in an area they feel safe walking home from the tram stop or, you know, walking at night, that sort of thing. So it is putting them into those blue chip areas. And there's plenty of them to choose from. Like, it's, you know, it's actually a good brief to work on. But yeah, it's
And
a
you
really
can get them for under 600 grand as well, right? Like
sometimes.
in those areas that you mentioned.
yeah. Look, the inner is probably more like a 750 to 800K for a good 2-bedroom.
Right.
But yeah, that's kind of, the ballpark.
But if it's a young person earning a really good income,
Yeah, for sure.
that's a relatively achievable price point.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think the security is probably the biggest piece of it, and just not wanting to make a mistake
Interesting.
and have something for themselves. So yes, I'm single now, but will I meet a partner? If so, will we upsize together? I want something I can always have as my own. If you know, if something fell apart later down the track, I've got my home base. That's really the biggest thing.
Like from an independence point of view,
Yep.
because I think that's a new trend now, right? Like I think, you know, feminine power and all the rest of
Totally,
it is
yeah.
like, I want to do this on my own or
Yep.
have the capacity to do it on my own.
Yeah.
So how big of a driver is that?
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And whether there's more exposure to it, although I don't think we're represented as much as probably should be on, you know, socials and that sort of thing.
More content, Emily, more
more
content.
content, I think so. Do you know what? There's a lot of content around finance. You know, you spoke to Tash.
Yeah, look at Tash, and there's
that's a great platform.
another young
Sim
girl.
from Girls That Invest.
Yep.
Emma from the Broke Generation. Like, there's quite a few good.
Tash just got Forbes 30.
I know, I saw. It was so cool.
Good.
Do you know what I was?
I was like, I didn't make the cut.
I was at lunch with her when you texted about this podcast.
Oh,
I was
really?
like, Jack just texted. She's like, oh my God, that's so, yeah. It's funny how these
Crushing.
things happen. But there's a lot of finance content out there. Get your budget right, you know, your spending habits, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
There's not a lot about, okay, now I've got that foundation right and I've got my cash flow sorted. Like, okay, I want to buy a property, now what?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the gap that I hope I can fill for people, but also just giving them confidence in actually going to buy a property. Even some people, and I know this probably can sound silly for lack of a better term, but they don't feel deserving of a property sometimes. Like, it's this barrier of like, that's a big deal for me. Maybe I'm the first single female in my family to do it. So it's like, you know, am I actually allowed to do that? Should I be doing that?
Yeah, there's like those limiting beliefs.
Yeah,
right? That's
very,
interesting.
yeah.
And you know, the biggest thing you see all the time, every time I create a bit of content on this, it always goes off. The deposit piece. And like, you know, everyone's like, it's going to be so hard to get into the market. What about our kids? And blah, 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 blah. I don't unfortunately believe in that. I think if you work hard and you stay consistent and you sacrifice just a little bit,
Yes.
you can make it happen.
Yeah.
You're a living example of that, as am I. How a lot of these clients of yours, most of them being young women, getting into the market? Is it deposits? Is it, you know, parental help? Is it inheritance? Is it guarantors? Is it a combination of everything?
It's a mix. Some have a really good deposit, like a really healthy, like a 200K deposit. And some of that is inheritance or early inheritance. I'm actually seeing a lot of that, like mum and dad or mum or dad want to see their children spend the money while they're still here, which I think is a really nice piece to that.
Yeah.
Like,
There's a book called Die With Zero. Have you heard of that?
No.
talks about it as well.
Okay, yeah. And I think it makes sense. Like, I think of my future self. I'm like, yeah, I'd like to see that, unfold. Then there's circumstances of inheritance when, unfortunately, parents have passed away. But also parental guarantor is like the biggest way people are getting in.
The bank of mum and dad,
Yeah,
right?
bank of mum and dad. But they're nervous to say it. They're like, oh, well, yeah, we've got 20% sorted. Okay, cool. What do we need to factor in with, finance time? Or, and it comes out that, yes, we've got a guarantor loan. Cool. So do 70% of my clients as well. Like, it's not that big of a deal, but people are very, like, all guarded. Like,
yeah, because there's judgment around it, right?
There is, totally.
If you go online and say, hey, I just bought my first property and it was a guarantor, like, I can near guarantee you'll have, like, 100 comments, like, fuck you.
Just because your parents are rich.
Literally.
But it doesn't actually mean your parents are rich. It means your parents have an asset they can leverage to help you get in. It doesn't mean that they're
the big
billionaires.
misconception, right? It's like, it's just a security that the bank takes over the top. They don't even need to have the money.
Yeah, they're not handing out physical cash to their children.
That's right.
It's literally their property used as security.
And if
for a loan.
anyone, for the most part, who's bought a house in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or any capital city over the last 10, 15, 20 years and still own it now,
yes,
it'd be hard to find someone who hasn't made significant money and has a lot of equity in their property.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So
why not tap into it? It's there to leverage. That's my opinion.
There's this big self-pride piece around that. Like, people feel shame to share it, and people want that pride. Like, I saved a deposit.
Yeah, I just think it's unrealistic to think that you could. Well, depending on salary, right? But the rate of saving can be very difficult, particularly beyond your first one to get into your next.
For sure.
Can be quite a challenge. So
especially if you're living out of home. If you're living out of home, like when you bought your property, were you living at home or out of home?
I was out of home. I moved out of home when I was 18 and I bought at 23. So it's
how did that happen? Run us through that process. You moved out at 18, living by yourself with friends.
I moved to Melbourne from Tassie.
Right.
I lived at uni for a period of time.
Right.
And then I moved out with friends in a share house. I paid $135 a week for a massive room in an old house.
Yeah.
One bathroom between 6 people, and then started in the workforce and got into recruitment. Saved a bit, but I had, even for an investment property, I had a portion of my loan as guarantor to get in. But on the proviso that you pick a property that is going to grow enough that you can get that off as soon as you need to. And it was within 2 years that was taken off.
And that's another thing I don't think people get, right? It's like if you have, hypothetically speaking, you buy something for 500 grand.
Yep.
Parents put $50,000 of that 500 against their property as security.
Yep.
As that $500,000 property goes from 500 to 550 to 6 to 700,000, say, you can then refinance and remove your parents' property as a guarantor. So they've literally done nothing other than sign a signature.
Yep, pretty much.
They haven't put any money out of their pocket.
No.
Hasn't cost them anything for you to buy the property.
Yep.
They've just said, if the worst was to happen, $50,000.
We've got it backed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So, and that leveraged me, really well. Although obviously going into business and very much starting from the ground up, there was a period of gap there where I'm like, I just need to make money to pay my own rent.
Yeah.
But there's certainly there's merit to getting in as soon as you can, I think.
100% merit. I mean, you wouldn't regret buying your first property, I'm assuming?
No, not at all.
And I think it also gets you into that forced savings, right? So one of the challenges most young people have, whether it's women or men, to save their first deposit is they don't really have any commitments.
No.
So nearly 100% of their income is disposable. And they're like,
let's party, let's holiday.
Deposit or Europe. Europe seems funner because it's in the short term, right?
Yeah.
Well, when you've got to pay Mr. CBA or NAB or ANZ every single week before anything else, all of a sudden you become way more responsible with your money.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing that a lot of people don't talk about is the psychology of letting the deposit go. So I've actually had conversations with buyers who hesitate. They love the property that comes to buying, and it's not the commitment of the house, it's my bank account's going to go down to zero once I buy this and I have to start all over again. There is such a psychology around that, letting that money go.
I know what it's like.
I mean, it hurts, right?
It's
it totally
worst.
hurts, but you got a house, you can't have both.
I find the same thing when I just did a big refinance of a few of my assets and had nearly 7 figures in the bank and in equity, and it all went into another property.
Oh gosh.
And it was like, when it comes out, you sit there and it gives you this sense of even if shit happens, I'm going to be totally fine. But as we know, cash sitting in the bank is useless, right? Because you can't see it, but it's deflating in value because everything's getting more expensive. So the dollar that you have here is not going to buy you the same in 5 years as it does right now.
Totally.
But when it's in a real estate asset, again, you can't see every single day that property is growing in value.
No.
But if that money was entering your bank every time the property went up, it entered your bank.
Yeah.
Everyone would do it.
Yeah, and you got to sort of think of it that way.
Because that's what's happening.
Yeah. But you kind of, I mean, if everyone thought that way, then we'd be in a situation where we had property prices up here, because everyone would jump on it.
Which would be good for property owners.
Yeah, well, yes.
Not good for first-home buyers.
No.
Great for property owners.
But it is, you know what, I think any wealth creation, anything around money, property, finance is such a psychology. And it's so interesting to watch.
And Tash talks about this stuff all the time, right?
Yeah.
The psychology of money.
Yeah. And
a
it's
lot
fascinating.
of people, they don't grow up with the education around it, the confidence around it, and that you said earlier about that limiting belief, or potentially like they don't believe they deserve it.
Yeah.
That's usually because they have a lack of confidence when it comes to financial literacy.
Yeah.
It's a super fascinating thing. So how, like, as a portion, say, of 100%, how many of your clients would be that first home buyer? Young
first home buyer is like 80%. Next home buyer 20%.
Right,
yeah.
So they're selling out of their first or leveraging out of their first into their second.
Yes, yeah.
And
usually a couple who might own their own properties each, and then they're joining forces together to go buy something.
Yeah, and generally keeping their existing assets.
Yeah, a lot of the time they are keeping. We had one recently who had to buy and sell in succession of each other, but yeah, a lot of the time trying to keep what they had, and flip it to an investment.
It's a fascinating thing, and like, if people didn't hear what I said before, you can still get into Melbourne, one of the biggest cities in Australia, within 20 k's of the city by the sounds of it, for like 600 grand.
Yep.
You need a 5% deposit.
Yeah.
$30,000.
Yeah.
Break that down. Let's say you're 18 now, 19, 20, 24, whatever you are. You should be able to save 30 grand in 2 or 3 years.
You'd hope so.
If you're earning the average income for that person's age.
Yeah. It's about sacrifice.
Yeah, and it's like, you can still actually live as well. Like, you say, okay, I can afford to put $200 away a week. Okay, $200, and I can near guarantee if anyone looked at their budget, there's $200 going in like 4 or 5 transactions.
Skincare, number one.
To go down the shop now and get like a hamburger or like, to go out for dinner with some friends, like a cocktail's $30.
I know, it's ridiculous.
How many young people would have more than 5 cocktails or drinks a week? 90+% of them.
Yeah.
If you could do $200 a week, it's 10 grand a year, 3 years, you got 30 grand, you got your first house deposit. You start saving at 21, you've got it by 24, you start saving at 24, you got it by 27. Like, that's how easy it is to break down, right? And that's why I always say, right now, I don't think there's never been a better time to buy your first property.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's always that way, though. People wish they bought yesterday. We always say the best time to buy is yesterday. The next best time is today. But really, I think the whole ego thing that comes into, like, sacrifice is a really big deal. John, who I co-host with, he often talks about free vesting, and that's where you live with mum and dad while you build up for your investment property.
That was me.
If you can.
I was a free vestor.
Yeah, and like, how good,
I know.
Not only the family piece of being able to spend time with them, but you're living in a property, maybe you're paying board of, but it'd be below market rate, I think, of what rent would be.
For sure.
So yeah, free vesting is a great, and I appreciate not everybody has access to that. But then the next best thing is go into a share house,
not everyone has access to it, but the vast majority do.
Yeah.
Like, there is people that don't, but like...
Yeah, a family member of some sort.
Yeah, like you have, whether it's mum or dad, auntie and uncle, brother or sister, or like...
Yeah.
Most people, if they wanted to, could live with someone.
If push came to shove.
And pay less than what they could.
Yeah.
Like, in the public market.
Yeah, definitely. And
it's the easiest way to get in. Because I always say, like, as a first home buyer, and you would see this all the time, the sooner you are or become a first home buyer, the easier it is. Because as you go through life, you get life baggage.
Yeah.
You have children.
Yeah.
You have a partner.
Dependence,
You have, like, all of this shit that goes on in life. And then all of your disposable income is obsolete.
Yes.
And it becomes harder then to go as a 35-year-old. Hey, mum and dad, do you mind if I move home? Not because they wouldn't let you.
Yeah.
It's because you
Extras.
have this ego, right? It's like, you can't do it. So
yeah, so true.
That's so fascinating. If we've got, say, that next person that you said, so they're not the first home buyer, but they're the second home buyer, or they're the second home investor.
Yes. And
let's say they've now conjoined forces with a partner.
Yeah.
Bigger budget. So they're spending $1.2 million max budget.
Yeah.
Where are we buying in Melbourne for that type of budget?
It's funny the jump from apartments to houses, because 1.2 doesn't get you very much. You'd think it would on the basis of it, but it actually doesn't. So 1.2 budgets, we're looking at really townhouse territory.
Right.
Probably 2+ study, 3-bedroom in like the sort of inner north, so Preston Thornbury area, the Brunswicks, and then on the southeast side, probably like an oversized villa unit, one of 3 on the block
Yeah.
in like a Carnegie sort of Glen Huntly area. So they're still relatively central.
Yeah.
But to get a house, it's going to be a single fronted terrace home that needs work, 2 bed, 1 bath, probably no car in like Richmond.
On a busy road, probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Or
What
very
do you
small
need
land.
to spend now to get like a good inner city terrace or, semi or something like that?
Like 1.6, 1.7.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's Torrance title, probably with parking.
Yeah.
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 And they're the best suburbs in Melbourne,
yeah,
right? Like
for sure.
You're
Anything that's got the terrace homes is, like that's how you kind of measure where the inner city is by the terrace houses.
right.
Yeah.
And do you guys do much in like your Geelongs or your Frankstons or anything like that?
No. We're very central to where the office is.
Yeah.
Frankston, we have bought in Frankston South and Mount Eliza before.
Yeah.
But we're a bit closer up near Mordialloc now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Closing words before we wrap up and I'll give you
closing
back
words.
to Sydney.
Look, I think the biggest thing is, obviously you're more on the investing side, I'm more on the home buying side.
Yeah.
I think there's a fit for everybody when it comes to property. Like we both have our own opinions. Everybody out there who's in the property space have their own opinions of what is the right thing to do.
Very true.
But I think it's there's back to this, ingrained mindset thing. There's things that people will just believe is their truth of what they should do or shouldn't do. And so it's so interesting when there is a lot of content out there. It can get overwhelming and confusing out there as a consumer to know like what should I be doing. I think education's key though.
100%.
Listening to this sort of podcast, consuming content from people that you trust and like is really important.
Yeah.
But try not to get overwhelmed.
Yeah. It's literally so true. I remember when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, I was listening to everything. I was listening to Property Couch with Bryce and Bear.
Yeah.
I listened to Bushy Martin. Everyone had a slightly different opinion.
Yeah.
Where to buy, what to buy. And then I found Chris and I was like, I just resonated way more with him.
Yes.
And I was like, that's my strategy.
Yep.
And I'd also seen the other side of like the off the plan and the
There you go.
house and land package. It didn't work. So I was like, it made what he was saying hold it even
Of
more
course.
weight.
Yeah.
So I'm 100% for that. Yeah. I think it's like listen to all the information and then work
Yes.
out which is most relevant to your situation.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot out there.
Emily Wallace, let's try not to make it 6 years between.
I know, right?
between
It's crazy.
next catch-ups. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
This is general advice and does not take into consideration your objectives, situation, or needs. You should consider if this advice is suitable to you or your circumstances, and please read any applicable PDS beforehand. This is a Henderson podcast production.